I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake.
I'm Rosie.
And today we're talking about cartoons from Cosgrove Hall, chiefly Count Duckula, which we're going to talk about last and get the other ones out of the way first, because I don't think that we've got that much to say about them. The Cosgrove Hall cartoon that people remember and is mentioned in the Guinness Book of Classic British TV is Danger Mouse. And Danger Mouse was on TV for a long time, from 1981 to 1992. It was going to be to 1991, but then it was delayed for a year because of the Gulf War, I read coverage of. And I remember watching Danger Mouse when I was very little, but I never really liked it that much. I suppose I liked it more than the real Ghostbusters, for example. But it was not something I would go out of my way to watch. But then I don't think the genre, the secret agent genre, really hooked me in the same way that the faux horror vampire genre of Count Duckula did when I was a little older. And Danger Mouse is something one can come across on things like Boomerang, and they have repeats of it on BBC Two in the mornings and holidays, various times this century. And it's alright, isn't it?
Yes, I just barely remember it being on television once when I was little. I did watch it quite a bit when I was babysitting, and it was on Boomerang, sort of just over 10 years ago, or even more like 15, on the date of recording, because it was quite diverting. And yes, it was alright. Quite enjoy.
And of course it has in the title role of Danger Mouse, Cosgrove Hall's greatest asset, I think we both agree, David Jason. Started playing Danger Mouse about the same time as he started playing Delboy, perhaps his two most well-remembered defining roles. And of course we can hear him as Count Duckula in Count Duckula. And another thing they were very famous for doing, Cosgrove Hall, was The Wind in the Willows, which wasn't cartoon like the other things we're going to be talking about. It was stop motion, and I remember watching that, and I think it was a bit boring. But David Jason was in that too.
I have no memory of that, but I do remember watching two other adaptations of Wind in the Willows at various times and trying to read the book and finding all of it incredibly boring, so I expect the Cosgrove Hall one is boring to me as well.
Yes, it's very well thought of and very beautifully and intricately made with these lovely models and things, but the substance of it never really appealed to me. I don't think you either. And now, as everybody knows, Count Duckula was a spin-off from Danger Mouse. Count Duckula being one of the many wacky guest characters that Danger Mouse encountered over his many series. And he's quite different in Danger Mouse than in his spin-off show. The main thing being that he's a real, active, blood-sucking vampire. And he's after fame and fortune, isn't he? Which is something that's sort of taken across to Count Duckula, the show, but they don't find it easy to stick with as a main character-defining trait. Lots more about that sort of thing, Count Duckula, later. But it's interesting to see his appearances in Danger Mouse, isn't it? Just to see where he's spun off from.
Yes, I only remember seeing one on YouTube or something. I think you were showing it to me and saying, oh, look, this is interesting. This is Count Duckula in Danger Mouse. And I had just kind of not really thought, oh, yes, he'll be a real vampire. I kind of thought he'd be the same thing. But then I thought, no, of course he's a real vampire in this, because it's just a cameo and he's not a protagonist. And what I remember is that he's kind of drooly and slurpily talking to Danger Mouse and possibly Penfold, although I don't think Penfold is saying anything. And they're scared of him, and then it finishes up with him threateningly saying that he wants them to do something for him, and they're like, what is it, Count? And he goes, can you get me on television? And that's the thing I most remember, that line at the end of the scene.
I was interested to read quite recently that before Cosgrove Hall came up with the whole concept of Count Duckula for Danger Mouse, there was an American cartoon vampire duck, which didn't really take off in a big way, in the 70s, called Count Quackula. And I've been wondering to myself, is Quackula or Duckula better? Quackula properly actually rhymes with Dracula, is quite nice, but Duckula also has the initial D like Dracula. Interesting point that. Is either of those better? They're certainly both valid ways of adapting Dracula the Ducks.
I think they're probably about the same.
Now, as everyone knows, and as has been mentioned, Count Duckula was a spin-off from Danger Mouse, and Count Duckula itself had a spin-off show from it, Victor and Hugo. And when we were watching all the Count Duckulas on DVD about 10 years ago, or just over 10 years ago now, it's amazing where the time goes, it was not surprising to see that of all the guest antagonists that turn up in Count Duckula from time to time, the ones that were turned into human characters from bird characters and got their own spin-off show were Gaston and Pierre, French crooks, who were turned into Victor and Hugo, human French crooks. But I was amazed when you told me recently that other characters in Victor and Hugo's universe aren't people at all. They're anthropomorphic animals. So why bother turning them from birds to humans if they're not going to be in a human world?
Yes, every single one that I saw was not human. I watched bits of an episode, but I couldn't manage to watch it all the way through because I was finding it a bit boring. They are the only humans. And the one other character that I think may be in it regularly, or at least recurring, is this mouse mechanic who comes and fixes their van when it breaks down. Unless you count this parrot that's in a cage in the van with them and says things to annoy them, but that's actually not anthropomorphic, it's a normal parrot. So it's all a bit weird, really.
Very, very strange. I always think of Victor and Hugo as what I call a nightmare prelude, because it had two series on CITV in 1991 and 1992, the end of, and they used to have it on Fridays as one of the programmes leading up to, at the end of CITV, Nightmare, which was always the highlight of my week. And I used to think I quite enjoyed it, but as Rosie was saying, it's hard to sit and watch now. It's rather boring. Gaston and Pierre, as I was saying, are very funny on Count Duckula, but do they really transfer to their own series of 30-minute episodes? Not so well, I think. Rather like Pinky and the Brain coming off Animaniacs and getting a little lost in a longer time slot, I think.
Yes, it's probably quite diverting when one is a child and has been at school all week and just wants to sit in front of the telly and watch just about anything then, can't you? And what I was watching on YouTube, they were trying to do this train robbery and they were getting on the wrong train and stuff like that. So we might have found bits of it quite amusing and all of it watchable when we were younger, but I think it doesn't really stand watching again when you're grown up.
And, of course, David Jason is in that as Hugo, because he was Pierre in Count Duckula. And Jimmy Hibbert comes over from Count Duckula as Victor, and they have their funny little catchphrases that they do together. That is what I said. It is always your fault.
Nothing can go wrong.
And that's what I think anyway, and things like that. We used to like those little catchphrases and things in the show.
The one thing I actually do remember happening from when we were young is that they shrank for some reason, and they ended up in one of those arcade machines where you try and grab a toy with a grabber, and this girl got them out and then she went off crying because she wanted a different toy that was in the machine. But I don't know how that came about.
I was saying recently how a lot of cartoons have one where they shrink. We were watching Defenders of the Earth, and there was one of those coming up. And Count Duckula has an episode where they shrink for some reason, and I was remembering how original He-Man and She-Ra both have one. So obviously Victor and Hugo stuck to that cartoon staple as well. And then I suppose Cosgrove Hall really went on from mainly producing Victor and Hugo to mainly producing Avenger Penguins, which doesn't have David Jason in it, although it does have some good voice work, some of it from Jimmy Hibbert and some of it better than Jimmy Hibbert. And I remember it being on CITV, Avenger Penguins, but I don't think I watched it religiously, but I remember being there when it was on, and I thought of it as something that Rosie watched. And so did Rosie, I think, and that's why she bought the DVD of it. in slightly more recent years, but it was quite a revealing experience, wasn't it, having the DVD?
When I saw that the DVD had been released, I was absolutely, oh my god, I must get it. I used to love Avenger Penguins. It used to make me laugh myself silly. And I don't know why it did, or why I was left with the impression that it did, unless it's from this one very memorable episode, which we'll tell you about. But I do recognise on the DVD the first bit I ever saw, which is where the villain, Caractacus P. Doom, is dangling the Avenger Penguins over a big vat of some sort of harmful liquid, which is in the first series. And I got into it after that, and I watched all of the second series, and I thought I loved it. It's got a really good theme tune, probably, in fact, definitely the best bit, and the voice work is good. It's got, in addition to Jimmy Hibbert, Lorelei King coming and doing female voices often, although they didn't start off with her. Jimmy Hibbert does the main woman in it, Bella the Penguin, who all the Avenger Penguins fancy, and I find that a little bit annoying because she just sounds like Jimmy Hibbert doing a bit of a silly, effeminate voice. And I think, well, why didn't they just get Lorelei King to come and do it in her American woman's voice? And then there's Mike McShane, and I love Mike McShane. I think he does really good voice work on Avenger Penguins, and given that David Jason didn't do it for whatever reason, I think Mike McShane is more than an adequate replacement for him as the main voice in the show, because he's Marlon, who's the leader of the Avenger Penguins, or so they say, and he's Caractacus P. Doom. Rob Rackstraw as mostly Rocky, another Avenger Penguin, and then there's Jimmy Hibbert, who's Harry Slime, Doom's somewhat reluctant henchman, minion sort of thing, and Bluey, who's another Avenger Penguin and doesn't talk coherently and has an effect on his voice and is a little weird. And it's difficult to explain the premise because it's unsure of its premise. The way that they speak, certainly in the most memorable episodes that would leave you with the impression that you end up with, is that they are this kind of troupe of superheroes. Well, they don't have superpowers, but Avengers anyway, who deliberately find out that Caractacus P. Doom is trying to take over the world, because that's what he wants to do, and going and stopping him. But if you actually sit down and watch it, they generally foil his plans by complete accident. And in addition to that problem, it's just not very engaging, apart from a few bits, like this one episode, and a couple of other moments which are funny the first time or the first couple of times you see them. But I think mostly what I remembered was this episode called Surprise Fate, which is a takeoff of Blind Date, and I was a bit disappointed when I first watched it, actually, that the presenter wasn't an amusing takeoff of Cilla Black. May she rest in peace.
What were we watching Bucky O'Hare with the Toad version of Blind Date that had a better Cilla Black-like character, and that's an American cartoon, so God knows why.
Yes, I was wondering if their Cilla Black presenter on Avenger Penguins was supposed to appeal to the Americans, because they do American accents and have Mike McShane, who is an actual American anyway, and Lorelei King, and they have things like the president and other American words and concepts, and there is an episode which is fairly amusing in places where they go to London and they do it like an American misrepresentation of what London's like, very amusingly, but I suppose that appeals more to the English as a takeoff of an American view of England. But anyway, in Surprise Fate, Caractacus P. Doom organises it. You see, they come into this by complete accident, that the Penguins go on Surprise Fate so that one of them will be chosen by the woman, also a plant, an escaped lunatic, which I don't think you can have now, can you, lunatics and that kind of thing, called Annabelle the Animal, who eats anything which is black and white. I was getting a bit annoyed watching it recently that she has on a black and white dress and she carries a black and white bag. She ought to eat them, really, but never mind. And it's going to sound very stupid when I explain, but she chooses Marlon, who's wearing a gold suit so he doesn't look black and white. So they're going off on their date to this motel, and Caractacus P. Doom's following them and trying to get Marlon to take his clothes off. Well, not exactly, but willing him to take his clothes off. I don't know what he thinks they're going to get up to on this date. But a bit that does explain why it's funny is where Marlon's having a shower, so he's got no clothes on, and Caractacus P. Doom is communicating with Annabelle the animal over this radio thing, pretending to be her grandmother, who's dead, and used to give her mint humbugs, and that's why she's obsessed with black and white and stuff. And she's saying, "Granny, where have you been all these years?" Doom doesn't know what to say, and he asks Harry Slime. And Slime says, "At the bingo." And so Doom says, we get this shot of the radio thing, voice box he's speaking through, saying, "I've been at the bingo." And Annabelle says, "But Granny, you always hated the bingo." And you get another shot of the voice box, and you're thinking, oh, how's he going to get out of this? In his grandmama voice, and he goes, "You idiot, Slime!" Which still made us laugh the last time we watched it, even though the other episodes we watched, thinking they were not bad ones, actually had become a bit stale and boring.
Yes, it's very funny, that bit with the speaker, and Surprise Fate is definitely the best episode, but we noticed it really tails off towards the end, like all the episodes, really. It's just got more to tail off from. So yes, a strange animal, Avenger Penguins, and really I think the last thing that Cosgrove Hall produced, certainly the last one that made it onto mainstream television, CITV. But I thought you summed it up very nicely when you first had the DVD, and you put it in terms of the main problem with it is it's unsure of its premise. So we're unsure what the status quo is supposed to be as we come in. We can't really engage with what's happening. And I think, as a way of summing up Avenger Penguin's problems, it's unsure of its premise is very accurate, and it does rather nicely lead us back to Count Duckula, which is very sure of its premise, but the problem is it finds that premise very difficult, actually impossible to sustain, and to get lots of 20-minute episodes out of. And that's the main problem with Count Duckula. Perhaps it's too sure of its premise, but doesn't really have enough to do with it. Count Duckula had a lot of American funding coming into it, as the Americans like Danger Mouse, which is why David Jason gives him an American accent, and there's a lot of Americanisms in it. Like, for example, my mouth feels like the bottom of a trash can. And Count Duckula particularly will speak with Americanisms in his American accent. He calls the fridge the icebox and things like that, which can get a bit distracting at times, but I don't think it's something one notices as a young viewer.
And it doesn't really matter, as they're not British characters, they are Transylvanian characters. And that's part of Romania now, isn't it?
Yes.
Whereas in Dracula, if you read the book, you'll find out that they're talking about it as part of Hungary. So that's somewhat interesting.
But the premise that it is so sure of and can't really sustain is very, very nicely explained to us at the beginning of each episode in the opening narration. And we always remembered this word for word from the late 80s and early 90s.
Except for the words that it's impossible to get without the DVD.
Yes, the ones that get faded out. And indeed, it's very easy to engage, remembering the opening with what the show is supposed to be about and what it should be like. So when you come back and watch the actual episodes, you realise, oh, right, they can't really sustain and make a lot of episodes out of that. It's done in the style, the opening, of these old B-movie horror things with Barry Clayton doing such wonderful narration, and it's a very successful lead-in and definitely achieves the tone it's going for. It explains everything that you need to know very succinctly and perfectly.
You were saying to me recently, this opening is so memorable, difficult to remember what the actual show was like. And you were right, weren't you? We didn't really remember quite how it was until we got your DVDs.
That's it. It tells us vicious vampire ducks, but the latest one is a vegetarian vampire because of this bottle of tomato ketchup that's gone into the resurrection ceremony. That's fine. That's wonderful. That's all we need to know. And then, as you say, the change in tone from that very creepy, sepulchral opening explanation to the upbeat bit of theme tune before the episode actually starts makes you think, yes, this isn't going to be too scary. Everything's going to be fine.
I'm often saying, I think I've said it in podcasts, you used to find things scary and I didn't, but actually that opening of Count Duckula used to scare the bejesus out of me. And actually it was my first concept of vampires. I had never heard of Count Dracula, and when I did hear of him a few years later, I thought, that's what made them think of it. Absolutely terrifying. This menacing vampire duck with big sharp teeth and this atmospheric music. And then Barry Clayton's telling you the latest reincarnation did not run according to plan, and you sort of think, phew, the vampire duck isn't going to get me tonight then, whatever happens.
So really, that's the most successful thing about the show in many ways, and very much the most memorable, that opening sequence. And because that premise really is impossible to sustain, there are lots of different types of episodes that fit into all sorts of different genres, and lots of different ideas, some of which work, some of which don't, and a lot of the time it might as well not be a show about a vegetarian vampire duck at all. But I've always thought, and I think it's very true, that the most successful Duckula episodes are the ones that relate to the premise that they're so sure of in the opening narration, are the vampire ones. One that Rosie had out of the video shop when we were littler than we were when we got the DVDs, but not as little as when it was first on, was Dear Diary, which is a very good episode, one of the very best certainly, which is all about the vampire stuff and a nice bit of history, and you see one of Duckula's old incarnations related back to what's going on in the present. That hanging around the castle doing vampire-related stuff type of episode, which really is what you'd expect after the opening sequence, those are the most successful ones. Another one is Dr. Goosewing and Mr. Duck with the opposite potion, which Goosewing actually thinks is carpet cleaner, but that doesn't really matter because it leads into the opposite personalities things going on, which is another good cartoon staple, but you get plenty of vampire stuff in that.
We had on a video for a long time the one where they go to Spain, and what happens in Spain is that they meet Count Duckula's vampire cousin. It's not really clear whether they're related by blood in the sense that you and I are related by blood, or whether it's a vampire family like in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and it doesn't matter. But he has these vampire relatives, and they go to see this Spanish cousin who has the village in terror and is holding all these villagers, isn't he? I can't remember exactly what he says he's doing. But point is that he wants Duckula to do a bullfight because it's Spain, and Duckula says he'll do it if this vampire, what's his name, Don Diego?
Yes, that's right.
Lets the villagers go, and a very funny line, isn't there? I will let bits of them go. Not really any point then, is there? Because they'd be dead. And Duckula says, let all of them go or no deal. So he's doing this bullfight in exchange for freeing all these villagers. So I thought when that was really all we had of Count Duckula, that perhaps he did do quite a bit of saving people from evil vampires, and it would make a certain amount of sense if he did. And then why did we have that one with the roller coaster of time on the video at one point?
Oh yes, that was a video of various different children's shows, and it was on there.
Yes. In that one, they get on this roller coaster with this roller coaster operator, and it goes through time, and it finishes up with them. What is this? Even the climax, I can't remember, but they encounter this land of giant sentient vegetables. And I remember watching that and thinking, what is this? He's not doing anything like in Dear Diary, which was from the video shop, or the Spanish one on our video, and I found that very puzzling. But then if you watch the whole series on DVD, it's really a microcosm of the entire series. Those 3 episodes, rather different, with varying degrees of vampirism in them.
Yeah, I was watching recently Thundercats Season 1 on DVD, and we will come on to podcast about Thundercats later this year, I think. And somebody who loves it was saying in the special features, oh, it's so fantastic how it's a complete mesh of different genres and they all come together in the best possible way. It's got swords and it's also got magic, and I thought, yes, well, He-Man has swords and magic and does it much better than Thundercats. But anyway, I think with too many genres trying to come together, it clashes rather, and the show becomes a bit of a mess and a bit unsure of itself. Not unsure in the same way as Avenger Penguins, but unsure because it can't really sustain what it's trying to sustain from its initial premise. And I think that's definitely a big problem with Duckula. We'll have a chat about the main characters in Duckula and what we think of them, because whatever problems there are with lots of episodes not really knowing what to do and being very unsure of themselves and being a bit of a mess, the 3 lead characters are all actually rather excellent in their own ways. And perhaps that's what makes me really like Count Duckula a lot more than Danger Mouse and Avenger Penguins and Hugo and some other cartoons. I do like the 3 main characters and the way they are with each other and them doing various things together. Count Duckula himself, the latest incarnation of the vampire count who's been resurrected so many times back as a vegetarian vampire, is quite titillating as a concept. And it's interesting, various points in the show where you can spot his vampiric nature may not be as far beneath the surface as he would like it to be, like in the Amnesia one, which is another good vampire one, where he has sort of 2 personalities after getting hit on the head one after the other. You know, it's another TV show staple, you know the sort of thing. And initially, the amnesiac version of Duckula needs quite a lot of persuasion that you are a vampire, obviously from Igor, who we'll come on to in a minute. But then by the time he gets whacked on the head for the 3rd time, he's quite keen to be a vampire and quite vicious, and it's come back to him quite naturally.
Yes, I remember, as you were saying the first time, Igor's whispering to him what they're going to do when they go down to the village, and he's all, that's gross, doesn't that hurt? Only if you get your teeth caught in her necklace. He's like, oh, okay, if you say so, and then he gets hit on the head again, and then when he next gets hit on the head, and he sees Igor, he's saying, oh, shall we go and get those village maidens then? And then he gets hit on the head another time, and goes back to normal, and doesn't want to go and get village maidens, and then the 3rd time, Goosewing actually turns up, and they are talking about lunch, and Goosewing is saying, oh, what is for lunch? And Duckula's going, ha ha ha, you are, and chasing him round and trying to eat him.
So really, Igor's attempts to reawaken the vampire within may not at all be in vain. There's another one where Duckula thinks he's murdered someone and forgotten all about it for various reasons, and he's saying to Igor, oh yes, it's true, I can't fight it, I'm a vicious, evil vampire. So perhaps it is something he does worry about from time to time.
The interesting thing about that one is that it's written by Brian Truman, and the writer does make a difference. It's mostly Brian Truman who really overdoes Nanny, who he's the voice of, and has too many puns and misunderstandings, but does remember the vampire premise. And then there's Jimmy Hibbert, who does most of the really good vampire stuff, and then he ends up writing pretty much all the episodes, and they go completely in the wrong direction because he's obviously unable to think of any more Duckula episodes. And then there's Peter Richard Reeve, who rather forgets that Count Duckula is a vampire. And I brought that up because I just find it interesting. Most of the kind of thing you're talking about is Jimmy Hibbert, but then Brian Truman puts that into his episode. So some consistency across writers there with that point.
Yes, and we did find it interesting and necessary to spot who'd written each episode and identify them along the way and go, oh yeah, that was one of his. Because as you say, it does make a huge difference to how vampiric the episode is and often how successful the episode is. As I was saying earlier, the concept of Duckula lusting after fame and fortune around the world is brought over from Danger Mouse, but like the whole vampire premise, it's not really something that's prevalent and easy to sustain across a lot of episodes. There are some where he wants to be rich and famous for various reasons. The bit in the bullfighting one, like you were talking about, where he wants to do his juggling and unicycling act in the bull ring, that's sort of harking back to his original character. And there's the one where he wants to break the land speed record and become famous in that way. But it's not something that is consistent about him, because there's not really a lot to do with it. It's quite difficult to pin down what his characteristics are. Sometimes he's seeking fame and fortune. Sometimes, as you were saying, he's a bit of an angel from Buffy sort of vampire, redeeming the old evil deeds, doing good things, but not very often. Sometimes he's just sort of lounging around and being bored and disaffected and looking for excitement in his life. Sometimes he's going off round the world in the travelling castle in pursuit of fun and adventure or treasure or whatever they need him to want to be in pursuit of for the episode. It'd be quite hard to write a consistent character profile for him, I think. Because like the show, his characteristics and his motivations kind of adapt with the genre of whatever episode we're in. One thing it's important to note about him is he's not stupid. He's rather impulsive and thoughtless sometimes and will get him and Igor and Nanny into trouble in that way. But he doesn't do stupid things. Of course, he can be gullible if he thinks he's going to get something out of it. But it's not one of those ones where, like, Igor would be intelligent and Duckula would be constantly going around getting in stupid scrapes because he's stupid. Which is the sort of thing one might expect coming in and wouldn't be surprised to see if it were true, but it isn't true.
Sort of like Victor and Hugo, really. The point of them is they're stupid.
Yeah.
They are the bunglers in crime.
And Duckula is quite witty and always on the lookout for a joke, but that's really Cosgrove Hall's writing style. So yes, he's a lot of fun as a character, and very memorable, and a lot of aspects to him, not always very consistent, because yes, he is like show in that way as the title character. He just kind of is what he needs to be for each individual episode. But I think the other two main characters do have a lot more consistent characteristics and motivation than Duckula himself.
Really, I think the overall impression I get is that it's Duckula doing whatever he wants to do and dragging Igor and Nanny along with him because they have to do what he says. When I was young, I used to like Nanny best, and she actually is stupid, isn't she?
Yes, she's the one who will be the butt of all the this character's stupid jokes, and that's one thing that Duckula, this incarnation of Duckula, and Igor will agree on and laugh about together. Nanny's so stupid. But yes, Nanny is genuinely funny, as we were discussing when we watched the DVDs, and you were saying how you find her funny as a young viewer, and it's very easy to see why.
Very accessible humour.
Yeah.
Like when she crashes through the wall to come into the room, drops things, doesn't understand what's going on. She's a hen. I think pretty much every character is a bird, with two exceptions I can think of. There's a walrus one time and a duck-billed platypus one time. But she's a hen because she's like a mother hen clucking over Duckula, and she doesn't know her own strength, so she wants to cuddle him, but actually she's crushing him practically to death and that kind of thing.
And she does say some very funny things that ring quite true to that sort of character from real life. Oh no, don't rush, Nanny, or she'll forget. And she's great fun, Brian Truman having great fun doing her, obviously. And she is a very successful character. She certainly achieves what she's supposed to be like and makes us laugh in the ways she's supposed to make us laugh.
The interesting thing about Nanny is that, unlike Igor and Goosewing, she's designed purely to go with the vegetarian Count Duckula and is a bit at odds with the mythos of the dreadful dynasty of vicious vampire ducks. And when they are reminiscing, Nanny was obviously there. And in Dear Diary, with the flashback, you can hear her answering the door, and it's crashing to pieces, and she's going, "Oh, now how did that happen?" which she does all the time, but she never actually interacts with the evil Count Duckula, and she's not so much of a nanny as a housekeeper, because that kind of a Count Duckula you really can't see wanting or needing a nanny.
It really wouldn't work, would it? You can see exactly how the evil version Count Duckula interacts and go perfectly with Igor, but yes, they're not going to be standing for the kind of relationship that Nanny has with vegetarian Duckula. Most of the time, Nanny, it seems, doesn't really seem to be aware that she's been working for a vampire for the best part of 800 years. I think the only time she says the word vampire is when she's trying to talk about a banana and calls it a vampire for various reasons.
Yes, there is that time when she talks about one of the Duckulas stealing his father's best hemoglobin, which doesn't make sense, actually, because he was his father and his father's not there anymore because it's him because of the resurrection. But anyway, sometimes I get the impression that she does know he's a vampire, but she doesn't really think about or understand what that means. And sometimes she doesn't seem to be at all aware, but a lot of those times probably Peter Richard Reeve has written the episode and he's not aware either.
And then, of course, quite obviously, there's Igor, who has a very clear motivation. He wants Count Duckula to be evil and tries to encourage him to be so. But of course, he's very loyal to any incarnation of Duckula, however grudgingly in the end. And Igor, too, is very funny with how evil he is.
I didn't get that he was funny when I was little, and I didn't even get that he was evil. I'll tell you something. I only got that when you and I and our father were going to play Duckula, and I was going to be Nanny, and you were going to be Duckula, and you were explaining to him that in order to be Igor, he had to try and get you to drink blood. And I thought, oh, I never noticed.
And it very much works, and yeah, perhaps isn't so obvious and accessible as Nanny to the younger viewers, but it makes a lot of sense within the context of the whole thing, as you were saying, unlike Nanny. And Igor's voice was provided by Jack May, who they kind of had instead of the Penfold voice, otherwise it's a lot of the same people in the cast, and that was Terry Scott. Igor and Penfold, and indeed Spotty from Super Ted, which isn't a Cosgrove Hall thing, I always think of in a group together because they were voiced in the late 80s by slightly older, quite famous British actors who all died in the late 90s, in their 70s. Spotty was John Pertwee, as well as Terry Scott and Jack May, so I always think of them as a kind of group. They kind of come in with their style and add a lot to the show, and are well worth having on board.
Igor's a vulture, which makes a lot of sense, sort of symbolically, doesn't it? When I was little, I was quite happy that Duckula was dark, that's obvious. Nanny was a hen, and I got the whole mother-hen thing, I think. But I wasn't absolutely sure what Igor was, and I remember sort of assuming he must be an eagle, because I thought it was a kind of play on words with his name, but of course Igor comes from those Frankenstein movies, and there isn't any Igor in the book. And I guess they thought that would be a good name for that character. And I never noticed that he was confirmed as a vulture in the show, but he looks like one, actually. And I remember when we got the DVDs thinking, yes, of course, he's a vulture. So there's something resolved from when I was very young.
And of course that bird of prey beak that he has rather adds to any misconception that he might be an eagle, and I have had that as well. We mustn't forget to mention that Ruby Wax was the Lorelei king of Duckula, voicing a lot of female characters along the way as need be. Of course, Jimmy Hibbert did his fair share as well. And as was mentioned earlier, the narrator was Barry Clayton, who did this old B-movie horror-style narration so well. And, of course, he didn't only do the opening that we saw every week. He did individual opening and closing for each new episode. And he even did a guest voice in the final ever episode, which is rather rubbish, really, The Zombie Awakes. And he, of course, is responsible for our little closing exchange at the end of all our podcasts. And as I've mentioned before, I think when I said, let's do that at the end of all the podcasts, I was imagining we'd talk about Duckula before we actually have. But equally as memorable, really, as the opening narration is the fact that it ends each time with good night out there, whatever you are, in Barry Clayton's inimitable style. And sometimes they try and mess with it a bit, have slight variations. Good night, y'all. Y'all come back now. You hear whatever the episode's been about as appropriate. But we don't like it when they mess with it, do we?
No, stick with the classic formula.
It's just best to have good night out there, whatever you are.
And that used to scare me too. Speaking of B-movies, the images in the closing song, which is very upbeat and fun as well, isn't it, are kind of B-movie, black and white girl running away from vampires all over it, and mummies and classic poses this girl does when her heart goes oompa oompa and stuff, and she's doing scared vampire victim from old B-movies, which is a very interesting touch.
That's so true, isn't it? It's so sure of its premise and its style and what it's taking off, but yes, it's not as sustainable as they probably hoped it might be, and the show is at its best when it manages to sustain that original concept. As was mentioned, the show has a lot of recurring antagonists, the main one, of course, being Dr. Von Goosewing, which you can work out from a very early age. It's based on Van Helsing, at least in name and accent, from Jimmy Hibbert.
Yes, or if you've never heard of Dracula or Van Helsing, you kind of work it out the other way around when you do hear of Dracula.
And he's a goose, and we don't think he's very funny. Some people think he's very funny, apparently. We don't like him very much.
We were discussing once, I think a long time ago now, how the real problem is he doesn't have anybody to talk to. He goes around on his own, and when he does want to say anything, he says it to himself, or he says it to Heinrich, who he believes is around, and it's never quite clear whether he actually made Heinrich invisible with his invisible ray, or he was never there in the first place, which is potentially quite interesting, but not really sustainable. I suppose at times I found it quite amusing when there's this sandwich lying around and he hasn't really mentioned Heinrich, and then he suddenly says it's Heinrich sandwich, which is touching on amusing, but then by the time you've got to that stage you're thoroughly bored of Heinrich.
Yes, I never really liked him when I was little, and coming back to the DVDs and thinking about, as you were saying, he doesn't have anyone to talk to, he's not very sustainable like the original vampire premise, really. It does make him a character who we see he's turning up in the episodes and you go, oh god, he's in this one.
Yes, he doesn't always seem to fit in with what they're doing. They're trying to do something, goodness knows what, and then he comes along trying to kill Duckula. Although when I was little I didn't mind him because I understood him. I got what he was trying to do, and that he didn't realise Duckula was a harmless vampire.
I suppose overuse is his problem, really. He's probably in more episodes than he's not in, and yeah, he's just not really sustainable. Perhaps he could have done with being scaled down, and the things that do work about him being featured when he was there. Perhaps he could have done with being recurring rather than regular, like the other antagonists are. And there's quite a lot of them. We mentioned Gaston Pierre already. It makes a lot of sense that they first turn up in the episode The Hunt by Notre Dame, where Duckula and friends are in Paris, having travelled there in the castle, which really teleports, and they say it flies, but that's a little inconsistency that we've never really talked about before and actually bothered mentioning when we watched it this time. But yes, Gaston and Pierre are French because they're from France. They're villains from Paris, and that's why Victor and Hugo. Of course, the names Victor and Hugo. Victor Hugo wrote The Hunchback of Notre Dame, nod back to the original characters there. And yeah, they get some excellent stuff out of Gaston Pierre, particularly the episode High Duck, which makes us laugh quite a lot. Gaston and Pierre going to hijack a plane at the airport, which wouldn't be very funny if it was successful, but is very funny in various ways. And we also enjoy their appearance in the episode called Chinese Takeaway, where they're running this Chinese takeaway in order to trick Duckula into doing something for the rest of the episode. And Gaston and Pierre disappear quite early in the episode, but they do some funny stuff in that one.
They're supposed to have drugged his food, aren't they? But Pierre was supposed to do it and hasn't, so that he'll be dead or unconscious anyway while they steal some Ming vases. That's what it is.
We are not to the Chinamen at all. It's very funny because you don't particularly realise they're trying to be Chinamen, but rather just themselves running this Chinese takeaway. But they kind of ran out of steam on Gaston Pierre after that, didn't they? And the last one they're in, Alps a Daisy, isn't nearly as funny as their earlier stuff.
Brian Truman wrote it, whereas Jimmy Hibbert wrote all their other ones. So that has a lot to do with it, I think.
So perhaps really they weren't ripe for a spin-off, as I was saying earlier. The Crow Brothers are, I suppose, the next most featured after Goosewing, probably, and it's kind of a play on the Cray Brothers, and I was mentioning this time, they don't really seem to think they are brothers a lot of the time, the Crow Brothers. They go around roped together trying to do crimes. Ruffles is the boss.
The David Jason one calls him boss, and at one point Ruffles says, "Why do I hang out with you lot?" or something like that.
You'll only hear them referred to as the Crow Brothers on the screen in this kind of array of villains in a very, very late, very, very bad episode called Dennis the Duck, Not a Duck.
Another bad use of Gaston and Pierre in that.
Yes, of course. Really adds to the effect of them having their peak and then not turning out to be completely sustainable in the end. That one has this character called the Egg, who's a sort of takeoff of James Bond villain stuff, with the attendant Oddbeak, who's based on Oddjob.
Yes, and he is a Chinaman, and it goes on surprisingly late how racist you're allowed to be with Chinese characters. But I hate that Egg. It's in 2 episodes, and actually I generally hate characters who are eggs. I think it's so stupid. I don't like Sheldon in Orson's Farm. I don't like it in American Creature Comforts, where they've made somebody be an unhatched or hatching egg. So when I saw this egg turn up at very much the tail end of Count Duckula and it really dropped off, I was not happy.
Now, before watching the DVD through this time, in preparation for this podcast, I just said, oh yes, it'd be quite good to make a DVD or whatever of the best of Count Duckula. I could think of quite a few episodes I'd like to put on there. And like with The Incredible Hulk, that would be the best way to watch it, really. The absolutely best ones, the vampire ones, some of the other ones that work quite well. And that would make the show come across as, oh yes, this is really very good, that kind of best of. But really, when we were watching it through this time, I thought, well, it really has excellent bits in very good episodes, not even consistently brilliant whole episodes, really. We've always liked, since getting the DVDs, Igor's Busy Day, which has a lot of vampire history in it, and Igor being very evil, wanting to lure the nice young couple into shelter for the night, do horrible things to them, torture them, squash them to jelly like you do with the old Duckulas. The world would never hear from them again, that sort of thing. But that has its very funny bits and sequences, that one. And Duckula's interplay with the nice young couple is very funny and quite well sustained. But again, you could pick the funny sequences out of that and have a best of Duckula sequences DVD rather than whole episodes, and that would be the best of it, I think. I take out the first few minutes of that Transylvania takeaway episode that we were talking about, for example. The sequence in High Duck where Gaston and Pierre are talking about how they're going to hijack the plane.
Pierre doesn't understand anything he's been told or why they're doing anything they're doing.
Rather like Avenger Penguins in that way. If you take out that funny bit with Annabelle the Animal and the speaker and a few bits from that London one that you were mentioning, that's how you could get the best of them. And there'd be a heck of a lot more of this done. But whole episodes don't tend to be, oh yes, this episode is a highlight, I think. It's bits that we take out and particularly enjoy.
Yes, there's that episode which is mostly stupid where the tower of the castle goes shooting off into space, isn't there? And we were thinking, oh, we're not going to enjoy this one. And then there were two bits that I can think of that really made us laugh, particularly when Nanny's, for some reason, going to open the door, and we know what's going to happen. She gets sucked out into space, and she does, and she goes, oh, which seems like a bit of an underreaction, and then she's just like floating about in space, not looking particularly bothered, and then they end up on this planet with the fluffy bunny sort of things, and like that bit with Doom speaking to Annabelle the animal, it really relies on the shot you get where they're up in the tower and the bunnies are down at the bottom. It makes it sound very silly, doesn't it? Which it is. And they're saying, oh, please come and play with us. And from their point of view, looking right up into the distance at the tower, Duckula pops out and goes, no, go away, which made us laugh.
Another great example. Two bits from an episode that we take out and put on the best of DVD, but you don't want the whole episode at all. That would be the best way to appreciate it, really. That one you were just talking about has a very deceptive title that makes you think it's going to be a fantastic vampire episode. Yeah. It's called The Vampire Strikes Back. You think, oh, The Vampire Strikes Back. Going to be turning into a vampire for some reason. But then, of course, you realise it's a play on The Empire Strikes Back, and it's all about space, which is a terrible letdown. There are some episodes that should be better than they are, like The Rest is History, which is supposed to be looking at the history of the Duckulas and isn't really very consistent all the way through. And again, one could take a few bits out of that for the best of DVD, but as a whole episode, it's not what it could be.
Is that the one where Brian Truman does an attempt at an origin story, and it doesn't actually make any sense?
Yeah.
Because there's this character called Igor who is making the first Count Duckula, as he calls himself, even though he doesn't know he's going to be the first vampire Count Duckula, and in fact he's the latest Count Duckula in a more traditional bloodline dynasty. This Igor is trying to make him into a vampire, and in fact he succeeds, which is why the whole thing's happened. But then he looks like Igor, but he doesn't seem to be Igor, or if he is Igor, doesn't seem to remember. And it's quite titillating in that you can see it could work quite well and have some interesting ideas, but the problem is Brian Truman hasn't really thought it through and doesn't understand himself how it worked.
That's exactly it. I was just wondering if Dear Diary, the whole episode, could be on the best of. And I don't know, all that stuff with the stake and the camera does kind of make the episode tail off a bit, I think. I think I might still pick out the bits, like the vampire flashback with Nanny answering the door and Duckula waking up in his coffin and things. I might still pick out those bits for the best of without wanting the whole episode, even in a very good vampire episode like that one. So that's why we've really had there a list of favourite bits rather than favourite episodes. We mentioned episodes with favourite bits, or at least bits with a lot of potential in them. And then some episodes are absolute rubbish and do suffer from a genre clash that ends up being complete mess, incomprehensible, and coming across very badly. There's two doppelganger episodes. The first one, Maggot's Farm with Sid Quack, being a lot more successful than the second one, Prince Duckula.
I quite enjoyed that one with Sid Quack, didn't I? I was laughing at bits of it. Duckula's swapped places with Sid Quack and gone to Maggot's Farm, and there's Granny Reeky and what's the Igor character? Basically, Nanny and Igor's doppelgangers are running this farm. Duckula comes back and he's got more money than they're expecting from the cow, and they're saying something like, oh, well, that's good, you can have supper tonight, or something like that. And you think, oh, well, yes, they're a frugal couple of farmers, maybe they don't feed him enough. That's what you'd expect from a farm run by cruel, frugal people like this. And then the Igor person says, can he do without his nightly beating? And I find that funny, because giving him a nightly beating isn't going to save any money, is it? It's just cruel and unnecessary. And the other thing is, later on they're telling him he has to shovel all the manure and take it to the far field. And you think, okay, fine, that's farm work. And back again. So it's just cruelty for the sake of it, really, underlining the lesson Duckula's learning, that the grass is not greener on the other side, especially when you are king of your castle.
So they really should have left the whole doppelganger aspect with that one, because they certainly got all they could out of it, and some decent material out of it, as you were talking about. But that Prince Duckula, the second doppelganger one, is part of this late run of very, very bad episodes, including Venice, A Duck, Not a Duck, and and the Mountie one, which we always remember with such venom, and the Zombie Awakes, which is trying to be very B-movie and isn't very good. And that batch of the last, 7 or 8 episodes, including all those, was for some reason held back and not shown on CITV for a couple of years. They showed it, I think, in 1993, actually after Victor and Hugo had finished. And I remember coming across it and thinking, oh, Duckula, I like that, don't I? And being rather disaffected with these last little run of episodes and thinking, oh, didn't think it was like this. So that's why I was always very keen to get hold of videos like we were talking about earlier and the DVDs when they came to see if it was better earlier on, and it was like I remembered. And yes, it was better, and it did have some bits that are excellent and would go on the best DVD, and it would be great fun to watch. But it's not an overall sustainable show that's really taken its place as a true classic like some of these shows we've watched and come back and podcast about. And I think we've explained pretty fully why not. And so there, our Cosgrove Hall podcast comes neatly to an end. And hopefully you've enjoyed it and will join us again next time, which will be the final Sunday in March, for a podcast about
Buffy the Vampire Slayer, continuing the vampire theme, and we'll tell you a bit more about Angel, who you mentioned earlier.
So until then, in the words of Barry Clayton, good night out there.
Whatever you are.